Newsflash, buddy. Now that Ryan Neuzil's back in the fold at center, will the Falcons' offensive line continue to be a strength they can lean on?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And if you don't know me, I am your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that is going strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this illustrious podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So, of course, today I am joined by Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta. We're going to be talking about OTAs. You know, we got to talk about practice. We're going to be talking about, the legacy of potentially some Falcons wide receivers and some recent commentary on some, games and seasons and plays that were called, a decade or more ago. Yeah, we're going back. We reached that time in the summer where, we've kind of exhausted all the topics. So let's go back in the time machine a decade ago, yes, and rehash things that have long since been buried, or at least thought we were buried. So we'll talk about that towards the end of the show. But we got to start with the news that happened late Wednesday night, which was the Falcons finally lock up Ryan Neuzil. We sat here all offseason long wondering why hasn't Ryan Neuzil signed his contract. We wondered if the Falcons were going to bring in some competition. And the Falcons were like, the reason why we're not signing Ryan Neuzil because we're trying to work out a second year on a contract. He signed a 2-year, $9.5 million deal with over $6 million guaranteed. That's the same money that Garrett Bradbury, a player that I think a lot of us, myself included, thought the Falcons might sign in March to add competition to the Ryan Neuzil battle at the center spot. That's what he signed for the New England Patriots. So the Falcons lock up Ryan Neuzil for the next 2 years, presumptive starter, not only this year, but potentially beyond in 2026, gives them some stability, some security, so they don't get, quote unquote, Drew Dalman next offseason. If Ryan Neuzil balls out, he's not going to go out there and sign a lucrative contract with some other team. And now the Falcons have to shop for their third center in 3 years or whatever. So it makes sense why the Falcons would want to bring Ryan Neuzil back. Jarvis, when you look at this move, do you feel like this is a good move for the Falcons and Ryan Neuzil?
I think it's a solid move. I wouldn't say it's a great move. And I wouldn't say it's a bad move. I just think it's solid because here's the thing. When I was not a proponent of Drew Dalman signing for the type of money that he signed here. By all means, if they develop you to a point where a team said, hey, man, we want to make you one of the top paid centers in the league, by all means, my brother, have a good life. Because that's not the type of money that the Falcons need to invest in at that position for that particular player. And I think that, when you think about that type of money, you have talking about having a Chris Lindstrom type conversation, and that he's nowhere near, just from a talent standpoint and from a resume standpoint, near what Chris Lindstrom was and is going to be for the Falcons going forward. So I feel like it was a solid move. It's just kind of weird. I don't say weird. It's interesting how confident the Falcons are in a guy like Ryan Neuzil. Even Terry Fontenot, who says absolutely nothing, who intentionally tries to give us nothing when he does press conferences, he said, I'm comfortable with Ryan Neuzil as a starter. Whoa, what? Wait a minute. You giving us information? Yeah. We're going forward with that. Yeah, Raheem Morris, same thing. Comfortable with him as a starter. Dwayne Leffler, oh yeah, he's a starter. And this dude's not even under contract. So for them to have that type of confidence to be speaking on that type of things, that tells me that these dudes were uber confident in his ability, uber confident that he wanted to get a deal done, and uber confident that nobody else wanted him either, right? So, or was willing to pay him that type of money to come play for their team. So it was just a situation where all parties involved was just like, all right, cool. We're going to get this done. It's just a matter of when. And they got the deal done. And I think it's a solid overall, type deal.
Yeah, I'm on a similar line, Jarvis, as you. It's solid. Like, it makes sense why the Falcons would do this. Get some stability there at the position. You get a solid player in Ryan Neuzil. He's shown that over the 12 starts he's had over the last 2 seasons when he's had to fill in for Drew Dolman. For me, it's just a question of have we maxed out Ryan Neuzil at this point in time? Because I know something earlier this offseason where people were like, oh, well, he's still a young player and all this. It's like 28 years old,
Yeah, man.
and it's one of those things where it's like, it's not to say that there isn't room for improvement with Ryan Neuzil, that he can't continue to climb that ladder. It's just, will he? Right. So I think you're right in the sense of, for all the reasons, the Falcons not wanting to have to go through this same rigmarole if Ryan Neuzil does, make that leap this year, again next year, and be in this position again, trying to replace a starting center. It makes all the sense that the Falcons would make this move. But as I said on the Atlanta Football Party, like, I am somewhat comfortable with Ryan Neuzil being the starting center. I don't know if I'm as comfortable as the Falcons are, and ultimately we'll find out this season, who was right, whose comfort level was the appropriate one with Ryan Neuzil. But now that the Falcons don't have to worry about that center position, at least for the foreseeable future, how are you feeling about the offensive line overall? I just recently was reading an article from PFF, and they were looking at every team's roster and looking at what was the strongest unit on their team and what was the weakest unit and what's the biggest move and all that stuff. And, the weakest unit for the Falcons in 2024 was the pass rush, obviously. And the strongest unit for the Falcons, according to PFF, was the offensive line. Do you feel like that will continue now that Ryan Neuzil is locked up on this team?
Wow. I think it does answer the question about the center spot, right? We know, having somebody that's familiar, and you have someone that's familiar in that spot, that's familiar with your quarterback, like you laid out earlier when we were talking on the Atlanta Football Party about how, hey, Ryan Neuzil and Michael Penix Jr. were getting a lot of reps together because they were running that second team offense. So they have some continuity. That's why I felt going into last year, the offensive line was the strongest unit, because those guys played together. They know exactly who's going to be the starter. They knew exactly what it was when it came to, being in sync as an offensive line, because especially in the outside zone scheme, those guys have to be in lockstep, literally, like taking the steps at the same time and working with each other and feeling who's coming into that gap, or whether or not I need to let this guy go, or I need to move on to the next level to try to pick up my guy so we can potentially break this turn this 10-yard run into a 50 or 60-yard run to the house. So I think all of those things kind of come into play when you talk about this unit. But for me, my biggest concern about this offensive line, to answer your question, yeah, I think this still can be the strongest unit, right? But my biggest concern is, when is the drop-off? When is Caleb McGarry going to drop off? When is Jake Matthews going to drop off? Because I think we take Jake Matthews for granted and say, hey, yep, Jake, we ain't got to worry about Jake at all. No, Jake going to be all right. He's going to be fine. But at some point, he has to fall off, man. He has to fall off. That's just how the NFL works. I know offensive linemen is a different beast, right? Especially when you have a guy who's seen his daddy play for 15, 20 years in the league, So when you have that entity that you have never had to worry about, I think at some point is going to have to break. That's why I was so big, and we've had conversations on here about getting that young guy that you feel can come in and can step in for him if need be in year one. I don't think Jack Nelson is that guy right now. If he, Storm Norton, true enough, is the backup, he'd be fine. But you're talking about just from a future standpoint, the future health of this offensive line going forward. Yeah, I don't know if Jack gonna be that guy. So for me, I feel like as long as everyone stays healthy, I feel like this team, that group can be the strong suit of this team once again in 2025.
Yeah, I agree with you. We will get to Jack Nelson here on Locked On Falcons. So, but I tend to agree with you. Like, I'm very interested to see where Jack Nelson is in 2 or 3 years, assuming that he gets that time being coached under Dwayne Ledford. But as far as like if the Falcons are forced to have to play him extended reps this year,
Falcons in trouble.
yeah,
Let me just say that they'll be in trouble
see.
if Jack
We'll see.
Nelson's getting a lot of reps.
Yeah. So, we'll see what I think right now the concern with the offensive line is depth at this point in time. I know that was considered a strength for the team last year, but now you have one of those backups that was a strength now starting in Ryan Neuzil. So we'll see if they can keep that conveyor belt, I guess you could call it, going with still developing that depth with the Javon Gwynns and the Kyle Hintons and the Jack Nelsons beyond just the guys that they had last year. So we'll see on that front. But, it is OTAs going on, Jarvis, and I want to pick your brain on sort of, what have you seen and heard so far that interests you, as well as what do you expect and want to see in the coming days and weeks as these continue over the next 2 weeks? And we'll get into all of that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. The NBA Finals are almost upon us, and you can head on over to FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA, to take advantage of those little hunches that you have, right? We know the Thunder are headed to the NBA Finals, but who's going to represent the East? I think we all kind of expect it to be the Indiana Pacers, but if you think the Pacers close out on Thursday night in Game 5, or the New York Knicks find a way to extend it to Game 6 or 7, you can bet on that. You can bet on how many threes Tyrese Halliburton's going to have in Game 5. You can bet on whether or not you think the Oklahoma City Thunder can sweep the Pacers in the NBA Finals. It's all there for you at FanDuel. So many different ways to win. So when you get that hunch and you're going like, I bet this happens in the game, you can head on over to FanDuel.com, sign up, and that little hunch, if you're willing to throw $5 on it as your first bet, guess what? If it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. So turn your hunches into $200 in bonus bets by heading over to FanDuel.com. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So the Falcons have organized team activities coming over the next week or so, OTAs as they are often called, and that builds all the way up to that mandatory minicamp that begins on June 10th. For you, Jarvis, what do you hope the Falcons accomplish, if anything, over these next few days and weeks?
Just a lot of the young guys who we're expecting a lot from. We've had conversations about how there's a lot of pressure being put on this rookie class to come in and produce, right? We went from, man, this pass rush is awful. They got no depth. So, man, they got so many guys that's coming off the edge. Oh, my gosh, who's going to play? How it's going to work out? What's the rotation going to look like? So I think having those guys out there on the grass, as Raheem Morris would affectionately refer to it as, you get those guys out there, you get them to understanding what their roles are going to be or what those roles are going to look like, understanding the playbook. Okay, here's a package that I'm coming in, James Pierce Jr. I don't know if you're going to be playing on first or second down early on. We'll have to see. That's going to have to be something that's going to have to kind of play out throughout the year. I'll be interested to see what that looks like in Game 6 or 7. Is he a 3-down guy? I mean, I would love to see it. So, when you think about all those different scenarios playing out and how rotations and all that stuff, I just want to make sure these guys understand what their roles are on his defense, and to stick with the defensive line a little bit. I think this also, what stands out to me is this whole Brandon Dorlus and Zach Harris and Big Nickel piece. I'll be really interested to see when those guys come in. And when I mentioned James Pierce Jr., he might be in a nickel on the end on 3rd and long. And if they're in a 3-wide receiver set or they're in 11 personnel on first down, we might see Zach Harrison and Brandon Dorlus. Like, okay, so what's the run game looking like for those two guys versus James Pierce Jr.? I'm putting you're going to be a situational guy on my nickel spot. So I think that's the type of stuff that I'm intrigued by, when you think about that big nickel package up front versus my speed NASCAR package, on 3rd and long. I think that's going to be very interesting to see who's going to be in those guys, like what guy's going to be paired with what guy, in those packages. I think that's going to be the thing that's going to be really interesting to watch. And I feel like the OTAs is how they start formulating those things and putting it together.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're talking about the amount of bodies that the Falcons have up front. Mm-hmm. And, it feels like, oh, this is a new development. But, I don't know if it is that new, because this has been something that I think we've talked about each of the last 2 summers, where they have a lot of bodies. The concern the last couple of years is it's like, some of those bodies were on the older side of the equation. And then the question was, they have a lot of guys that are NFL caliber players, but do they have enough guys that can beat the NFL caliber players on the other team, right? Ooh. And so I feel like this year they have a lot of bodies. Now they're on the younger side, and still that question remains: how many of these guys are going to go out there and be able to go up against a Tristan Wirfs in week 1 and beat that guy, Christian Darrisaw and Ryan Kelly in week 2 when they play the Vikings and beat those guys and whatnot. And you get excited about the potential, but you do wonder, did the Falcons overcorrect, right? They were too old and now they're too young. And so that's kind of the balance. I'm very curious to see, how ready are these young players going to be? And obviously these OTAs are part of the process of getting these guys prepared for the season. It's still early in the off season. I've said it before on the podcast, like if you put together a progress meter, like you had in a video game of how far along we are to the start of the season, we're like 2% of the way there at this point in time, based off of the amount of days and practices that we have to go. So I'm very interested to see how these guys look. But I think the value of this.
Let me speak to the overcorrection piece. I think it's interesting. I feel like that's why my disdain for them not focusing in on that in the first round, addressing the edge rusher spot in the first round, because you assume that that's a higher level of talent, meaning until they get adjusted, they're still going to show you something. They're going to show you that, hey, this guy was worth being drafted in the first round, like Jared Verse coming in for the Rams. Like, yeah, he failed a little bit and people were laughing at me. Jared Verse didn't get drafted until the teens, and you were talking about drafting him in the top 10. But hey, he was the rookie of the year, had TFLs and sacks and all that stuff. So yeah, so that's the floor, right? We talking about raised floors. So being that you have, sure, you're young with James Pierce Jr. and Jalen Walker, but you assume, I assume that Jalen Walker's floor is a lot higher than a guy that, you draft in the 2nd or 3rd or 4th round or whatever, so I think that, I don't think it's overcorrection. Sure enough, you know what I'm saying? When you trust what you see, that's what I'm real big on, is if you feel like James Pierce Jr. is worth it, hey man, that motherfucker got to produce. I don't care what scheme, maximizing potential, none of that. We got to see that thing game 1. Just like you said, and it might have to be against Tristan Wirfs. And we know who Tristan Wirfs is and what he's capable of doing. And I think that, so when you have that high floor talent in the first round, focusing in on that, true enough, they're young, but also what comes with young is a lot of motors and being able to surprise folks and be like, hey, I didn't know you had it like that, big dog. Like, I saw your film in Tennessee, but hey, yeah, it's real. And then that's when you start seeing those guys adjust. And then once those guys start adjusting by watching what you put on tape, then that's when you start to get into that next level stuff, right? So I feel like, I'm just looking for them to surprise folks in that first game. So I think that the youth, true enough, it's a lot of young cats. But hey, man, like when you drafted in the first round, man, that production got to come like immediately.
Yeah, no, and I don't mean overcorrection, like, oh, these guys are bums or anything like that. I just meant sure. We just don't know yet. It's just like, no doubt. Especially at this stage in the offseason when it's like all you're seeing is guys hitting blocking sleds, and it's like, all right, like,
And video 3-second clips are going
Yeah.
viral because he's pushed the sled up in the air. It's
Yeah,
like,
it's like, all right,
man,
hey, to do, you
hey,
do
bro.
the job that you're asked to do.
Yes.
You're allowed to hit blocking sleds. You're not allowed to hit Caleb McGarry at this point in time of the
Right.
offseason.
Right.
You're not allowed to hit Tristan Wirfs until we get to week 1. So
Look, I might put in a request, dog, for that matchup. Like one-on-ones, first day, pads on full pads. I might walk over to Terry like, hey Terry, man, I need to see JPJ versus Caleb. You know what I'm saying? I need to see where the floor is. You know what I'm saying? Where's the floor? You know, if he can get off on Caleb McGarry, hey, well, good. Well, hey, let's go. Yeah, I'm ready. I'm ready to roll game 1 against the Bucks, baby. Let's sign me up. I'm be excited that day. I'm be excited.
Yeah. I gotta check
that request.
I gotta check and see what if FanDuel has the odds for this, because I would, now that the NFL has that offensive line protector of the year award, I feel like the smart bet is probably to bet on Tristan Wirfs so you can make a little bit of money. But we'll see. We'll see if James Pierce and Jalen Walker can throw a wrench into that sort of a bet and whatnot. But it'll be interesting to see how the rest of this thing plays out, because it's like, they have a lot of talented players, and it's just like, we gotta see these guys get after it. So I'm looking forward to that. But speaking of talented players, the Falcons, go from a not bad segues. I'm terrible at these segues, Jarvis. But the edge rusher room is very talented, right? The wide receiver room is very talented. But no offense to the Drake Londons and the Darnell Mooneys and the Ray McLeods, but there have been even more talent in that wide receiver room in players in the past, like Julio Jones and Roddy White and Harry Douglas. And they have a new podcast where they're, venting frustrations maybe from a decade ago about certain things that didn't happen when the Falcons were at the height of their powers, back when they were a perennial playoff sort of team and Super Bowl contender that should have won a Super Bowl. But we're not going to get into that on today's episode, but we will get into some of the things that those guys have said on the Legacy Locker Room podcast that has just started up this week. And we'll do that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So Jarvis, Harry Douglas, Roddy White, Julio Jones started the Legacy Locker Room podcast. I have not, full disclosure, I have not listened to the podcast in its entirety yet. I've just seen the sort of clips that have been floating around over the last, 4 or 5 days out there. And I have some thoughts, but, I want to give you the floor to express your thoughts, because Jarvis, if you're going to say something out of pocket, then I'm gonna throw you under the bus as opposed to
what.
So I'm admitting I don't know.
You get in trouble, so I can be like the good guy.
I don't know what Jarvis is going to say, so he could just say something completely normal. But it's the third segment of a Friday show here, and that's usually when things get a little bit off the rails here on the podcast. So
Sure. Yeah.
I'm just going to let you go, Jarvis. What are your thoughts on some of the things that you have seen floating out there, with Harry Douglas, Julio Jones, and Roddy White from their previous experience in Atlanta?
Well, the first clip that I came across was the one where Roddy was talking about his differences with Kyle Shanahan. I think that can put it kind of lightly. Roddy obviously questioned a lot when it comes to Kyle Shanahan's play calling, and felt like he lost some games and all that stuff. And to be honest with you, man, I wasn't surprised at all, because I remember when it happened, and we were having some conversations around the radio station I used to work for at 929, and talking to some different people and some people who were familiar with the situation. And Kyle did not like Roddy. He didn't like him, and he was trying to prove a point when they went to him at the beginning of that game, and his position coach Terry Biscuit let him know that, hey man, they're gonna try to come to you in this play, and knowing that this play is not meant to come to you, just to prove a point. He's gonna try to prove a point. Terry Biscuit, he warned him, and Roddy said, okay. And I think that, so it wasn't no surprise. It was to no surprise for me that Roddy had these things to say about Shanahan. And to be honest with you, man, like, love Roddy White to death, but
See, now Jeremy. Okay. Wait.
I mean, like Roddy was at the end, you know?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? But is he worse than Leonard Hankerson? He couldn't have been at least in front of Leonard Hankerson. You know, I think he could have been in front of Leonard Hankerson. You know, I don't think that pecking order should have been put him below him, but he was towards the end of his career. So I mean, and it just goes back to what I've always said about Kyle Shanahan. Kyle Shanahan is a Richard. For those you don't know, look up the nickname for Richard. He's that. Full, yeah. And he gets it from his daddy. Nobody liked Mike Shanahan like that either. He was a hell of a coach, but nobody likes him. And nobody liked Kyle either. That's why people still blame Kyle for what happened in 2016. A lot of good stuff happened in 2016, but it didn't end well. But yeah, man, I think, Ryder was towards the end of his career with his team. Should he been handled like that just from a respect standpoint? No. But, I mean, the Richard had a point. He had a point.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, this was before Locked On Podcast Network existed, 2015. The podcast network started in 2016.
Sure.
And back then, this was the Falcons podcast, and myself.
You helped launch Locked On as a Locked On Falcons host. So don't let Aaron fool y'all. The man is a pretty big deal. Like he's one of the original hosts of this network. Yes.
I don't,
Continue.
Still looking for them checks, Mr. Locke, but no, okay. No. The previous incarnation of this podcast was the Falcons podcast, and we talked quite a bit in that 2015 season. Myself, Alan Stirk, my co-host then, about Roddy's fall off. And I was of the opinion then that Roddy was kind of cooked at that point in time. And so Kyle was kind of right. But as I've learned in the year since, I was maybe a little too disrespectful to the legacy of Roddy White at that point, given how much good football we had seen over the better part of the previous decade from him, and sort of, kind of being that edgy guy that's like, oh, well, I'm the only one that's going to tell you the truth about Roddy White, and he's kind of washed at this point in time. And I've learned my lesson from that. But at the same time, I think you're right, Jarvis. Like, in the larger scheme of things, Kyle Shanahan was right in the sense that, like, Roddy White was not the Roddy White of old, but certainly I think you're right in terms of handling him with a level of respect that was befitting of his station and his status within the locker room and on the football team. He did not handle that well. And so that also reflected how I talked about Roddy back then in 2015. The other thing that stood out to me in that podcast, Jarvis, again, just judging by the clips, is Julio being a little upset with not getting the ball more in the Super Bowl. And my take on that is, like, I love Julio to death. He's right there on the wall. That's the GOAT wall. Only GOATs go on that wall. So, but again, I haven't listened to the podcast in its entirety, so I don't know the full context of it. But I'm like, did you not know the game plan? Because, like, the Patriots' entire game plan was to stop you from getting the football. And then the 4 targets that you did get, like, you averaged like 22 yards a play. So it's like, it's a testament to how good you are that you were able, that with the greatest defensive mind over the last, like, 50 years to coach the game, that basically said, we're putting everything in it. We do not want him to touch the ball ever. And you still were able to get the ball 4 times and make big explosive plays and have the catch of the game, the catch of the century, that unfortunately got wasted because of, as you say, a certain Richard decided that he was going to decide to, get too cute there at the end of the game. So I get it. I get the frustration, but I'm like, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I look at it like this, man. Austin Hooper should have led the team in targets. Just saying. He would have like 7 targets for like 3 or 4 catches. Can Julio have 8 targets? And I probably would have bet some money they would have at least 6. You know what I'm saying? Like, I look at it that's how I look at it. I look at it from a standpoint, okay, yeah, we know what Bill Belichick going to try to do. And that kind of goes back to what this defense and having an identity, the things that like really tick me off when Jimmy Lake used to talk. You're like, oh, we're going to be react to such and such, we're going to make sure to be able to adjust. No, Mother Blanca, what y'all trying to do? What do you want to do? What's the number one thing? Number one rule? I know for when I played on defense, hey man, we stopping the run, dog. Like, you about to get up off this ground. We about to make you one-dimensional. That's what's about to happen. And then we're going to figure out the adjustments and all that other stuff. No, man, what we want to do is what we want to do. And I think I take the same approach to offense, man. Like, what do you want to do? We want to get the future Hall of Fame wide receiver this rock because we know, we'll put him up against anybody that you have on your team, and I'm going to figure out a way, Mr. Amazing play caller, which I've referred to him as, he's a Richard, but the man can call some doggone plays. You talking about play design and all that stuff? Yeah, man, let's match wit versus wit. We know what Bill gonna try to do. He's gonna try to take away Julio. But guess what? I'm gonna get him this rock, and we gonna go down trying to get him this rock. And I think that I'm with Julio, man, because Julio has some other frustrations. You know what I'm saying? Like, when it comes to how things ended, here in Atlanta, with Thomas Dimitroff and all that stuff. So it sucks the way it ended for him, man. Like, when you just think about it, from being traded, the whole Super Bowl stuff, and people questioning whether or not he's a Hall of Fame player. Like, what? He had 66 career touchdowns. He's just like, come on, bro. Like, I'm supposed to at least have 100. At least 100. But, that didn't happen. And people want to question why Julio may not have come back since he left. I mean, that might be part of it. And to be honest with you, with all what he's done for this team, this city, on the field, man, let that man be in his feelings. Eventually he'll come around, dog.
Yeah. I don't disagree with that, Jarvis. I'm very curious to see, because from what I understand, they were going to get into the whole trade thing towards the end, and they kind of left it on a cliffhanger and like, hey, come back next week for the next pod. And like, hey, I know a thing about a tease. I got you.
Look at you, Harry. I see.
I see what's going on. So I'll be very interested to see some of the other things, and at some point I'll probably listen to the whole episode to get the full context of all the various conversations that they had and future conversations. So I'll be curious about that. It was just interesting to me, where it was like, I don't know, like, only I get, every receiver wants the football, but like, I feel like in that game, like, you should have known that you probably weren't going to get that much opportunities, and it was just really about making the most of your opportunities, which I think he did. And so that's where, like, my perspective,
one of the best catches that will never be talked about.
Like, you accomplished everything that you needed to accomplish in that game that we wanted you to accomplish. Like, Bill Belichick, that game plan was like, I'm gonna let Austin Hooper and Taylor Gabriel, Mohamed Sanu beat me, and again, didn't quite work out the way the Falcons wanted it to work out. But I just felt like that's where the game was headed, and like, that wouldn't be my, like, if I'm Julio, my gripe is not I didn't get, or maybe my gripe is, if you're going to throw the ball at the end of the game, like, maybe I should have got that fifth target. Like, that would probably be my gripe, as opposed to like, I only got 4 targets. It's like, okay, all right, but hey, we'll see what's what. That's going to do it for us here on today's Locked On Falcons. We'll be back with more content coming your way, talking Billy Bowman, talking Jack Nelson next week on the pod, as well as what else is going on in OTAs. Any more revelations from the Legacy Locker Room podcast? So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by subscribing and following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And check out for your second listen the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast, where Joe Marino, Kyle Krabs are going to get you guys geared up for training camp, talking ball, building rosters, all that stuff. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.